Jonathan, we appreciate your years of service, but your role no longer aligns with our strategic direction. The words echoed in the sterile conference room like a sentence handed down without trial. Jonathan Miles sat still, hands folded neatly on the table, his expression unreadable. After 12 years of loyal service, he was being dismissed, quietly, cleanly, like an old office chair replaced during a remodel. Trinity Health Group, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, had just merged with a tech-driven medical conglomerate, OmniMed Systems, based out of Chicago. As expected, the new parent company wasted no time rolling out sweeping operational reforms, and Jonathan's name was at the top of the realignment list. The irony? He had once been hailed a hero during the pandemic, saving Trinity's supply chain from collapse. But that era had passed. Now it was all about dashboards, automation, KPI spreadsheets. And Lauren Whitmore Jonathan Miles, 52, quiet and principled, had joined the company after losing his wife, Catherine, to cancer. Watching her suffer through treatment in understocked hospitals had driven him to pursue supply chain work, not as a career, but as a quiet, personal vow to make sure no one else had to go through that. Lauren Whitmore, only 35, had just been flown in from Boston with a shiny MBA from Harvard and a mandate from corporate to streamline inefficiencies. She was the kind of leader who quoted TED Talks, loved buzzwords, and believed that relationships were optional, as long as the algorithm was good. From their very first meeting, the divide between them had been obvious. "We can automate 85% of the procurement process with the right system," Lauren had said confidently. Jonathan had nodded, offered no resistance. He had already seen this playbook: efficiency consultants, analytics first managers, data over people. And he knew how it always ended. Someone like him, who worked through human trust instead of dashboards, would be labeled outdated, then replaced. The termination meeting was held on a Monday morning. At the table were 3 people: Lauren, a corporate attorney, and an HR representative named Angela, who clearly looked uncomfortable. Lauren opened with the kind of clinical tone that came from memorizing scripts. "Your current role is no longer considered strategically aligned with our modernization roadmap. Your employment will end this Thursday. Your severance details are in this envelope." Angela handed him a pale yellow folder with a generic confidential label. Jonathan accepted it without opening it. No questions, no rebuttal, no request to be reconsidered. That made Lauren falter, just for a moment. She expected resistance, or at least a plea to stay. Instead, Jonathan smiled. "Thanks for letting me know in person. I understand." Lauren glanced down at her phone like the meeting was over. Angela spoke up timidly. "Do you have any questions, Jonathan?" He shook his head. Then he stood, calmly shook everyone's hand. Lauren avoided eye contact. Jonathan walked back to his office on the 11th floor, the same corner where he'd spent the past decade building quiet systems that saved lives. He removed his belongings one item at a time: a Crystal Award from 2020, a faded company ID from his first week, and a photo of him and Catherine on their wedding day. The one thing he didn't pack? His personal vendor Rolodex. It had never left his home. He picked up his phone and sent a single text. "Rick, something interesting is about to happen. Keep an eye on Trinity's vendor list this week." As the elevator descended, Jonathan took one last look at the floor where he'd spent the better part of his healing years. Marcus, the building's security guard, nodded solemnly. "Heard what happened, Mr. Miles. Sorry to see you go." Jonathan clapped him gently on the shoulder. "No need to be sorry, Marcus. They just don't know what they've set in motion." The elevator doors closed. What no one knew was that this story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. While others were trimming costs and chasing quarterly numbers, Jonathan was building something no spreadsheet could measure: trust. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't scalable. But when the world fell apart, that invisible foundation became the only thing that held Trinity's supply chain together. Rewind to March 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing. Hospitals across the southeastern U.S., from Tampa to Birmingham, were in free fall. Ventilators were back-ordered. Surgical masks had become currency. And Trinity Health Group was dangerously close to a total shutdown. Trinity's executives scrambled for solutions, but corporate policy tied their hands. Vendors needed to be pre-approved. Contracts had to go through 6 layers of compliance. Bureaucracy was paralyzing the system, so Jonathan acted. At the heart of this chapter was Jonathan Miles, still serving as procurement director, but already thinking 10 steps ahead. And in the shadows, a new identity emerged. Miles Procurement Advisors, a legal LLC Jonathan had quietly registered as a contingency during the chaos. Then there were the vendors. Rick Dawson, CEO of Med Supply Logistics in Texas. Mark Sullivan, Regional Director of CardioCore Supplies in Florida. A dozen others who had worked with Jonathan for years, not just on paper, but through late-night calls, urgent reroutes, and emergency storage swaps. Trinity's legal team refused to approve emergency procurement contracts without standard bidding procedures. But Jonathan knew those procedures would take weeks, and by then, patients could die. Faced with a choice between policy and people, Jonathan bent the rules, or more accurately, he found a way around them. He used his new LLC to make direct purchases. Technically, the hospitals were buying from Miles Procurement Advisors, not Trinity. It was unorthodox, it was risky, but it was legal, and it worked. One night, Jonathan drove 8 hours overnight to a warehouse in rural Texas to pick up a shipment of N95 masks that had fallen through the cracks. He delivered them himself to a hospital in Pensacola by sunrise. Another time, when a supplier in Louisiana lost power during a storm, he coordinated alternative sourcing from a partner in Arizona within 24 hours. While other procurement directors were forwarding emails, Jonathan was making calls from his car, working vendor to vendor like a battlefield general. During a particularly desperate week in May 2020, Rick Dawson called him directly. "Trinity keeps asking for discounts and red tape. You just solved the problem. From now on, we don't deal with Trinity, we deal with you." Jonathan hesitated. "You sure?" "Absolutely," Rick replied. "Next contract goes under your name." And just like that, the tide turned. One by one, vendors began listing Miles Procurement Advisors as the primary point of contact. Jonathan didn't ask them to. They chose to. By the end of 2020, dozens of vendors had informal side agreements with Jonathan's LLC. Not because he paid more, but because he paid on time, remembered birthdays, and never hid behind "we'll get back to you." Trinity's leadership never noticed. To them, everything looked normal. Supplies arrived, invoices were cleared, charts were green. They chalked it up to operational excellence. But Jonathan knew better. The supply chain was no longer Trinity's. It was his. Back in the present, Jonathan stood in his office for the last time. The lights flickered above as he looked around at the framed awards, photos, and worn-down coffee mug from a trade show in 2011. He closed his briefcase gently, gave the desk a final nod, and whispered, "They never saw it. 12 years, and they never really saw what I was building." Then he walked out, not empty-handed, but with something far more powerful, an entire network loyal to him, not the logo behind him. And that, he knew, would soon make all the difference. "Hey, Jonathan, heard you're out at Trinity. If that's true, call me. ASAP." It was the first of many messages. The dominoes were starting to fall, and the people who had stood quietly behind Jonathan for years were about to speak very loudly, with contracts, with decisions, and with loyalty. Jonathan had returned to his modest home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a quiet neighborhood lined with oak trees and the kind of mailbox that still held handwritten letters. There was no corner office, no assistant, no company car, just a man, a laptop, and a decades-deep network waiting to see his next move. His spare bedroom became his command center, a folding desk, a stack of vendor folders, and a dusty printer whirring back to life. The familiar names started rolling in. Rick Dawson, Texas, who'd once stayed up until 3 a.m. rerouting ventilator parts with Jonathan during a hurricane. Mark Sullivan, Florida, who trusted Jonathan enough to ship 6 figures worth of cardiac devices on a handshake. Angela, the HR rep, even sent a quiet LinkedIn message. You deserved better. But most importantly, the vendors weren't asking if he was starting something new. They were asking when. Vendor after vendor called with a simple offer, if you're going independent, we're in. But going independent meant more than just a logo. Jonathan would have to stand up a real company, bank accounts, insurance, licensing, legal frameworks, warehousing logistics, EDI integration, all from scratch. He could say no, retire quietly, and live off savings. Or he could bet on everything he had built, quietly, humbly, behind the scenes, and give it a name. He chose the second option. Within 48 hours, Miles Healthcare Logistics was born. He worked late into the night with a trusted lawyer from Des Moines, filed incorporation papers, set up a business checking account, and drafted a standard vendor onboarding packet. Then he made 6 phone calls, the same 6 voices that had stood beside him through the worst of the pandemic. He laid out his plan. Simple, reliable distribution. No bureaucracy, no games, just people who get it done. Every call ended with the same response. Send over the agreement. We'll sign today. By Friday afternoon, 5 major medical vendors, each representing tens of millions in annual sales, had signed letters of intent with Miles Healthcare Logistics. But they didn't just sign on. They also sent 30-day termination notices to Trinity Health Group, effective immediately. One by one, the contracts fell away, contracts that Trinity believed were locked in, managed, and stable. The reality? They had been balanced on a single man's integrity. And now that man was gone. Jonathan sat back in his chair that evening, a cup of black coffee in one hand, his cat curled near his feet. His phone buzzed again. This time it was from Greg Tran, a regional manager in Louisiana. Just heard what you're doing. We've got 5 hospitals that'll follow you wherever you go. Let me know what you need. Jonathan didn't smile often, but tonight he did. He opened his inbox and composed a single message. Subject: Transition Coordination. Vendor Disengagement. Effective. Monday. We will begin transitioning vendor services from Trinity Health Group to Miles Healthcare Logistics. All services will continue without interruption. The final piece was symbolic, but important. Jonathan picked up his phone and sent a short, cryptic message to Lauren Whitmore, the woman who had fired him just days before. Good luck next week. Then he turned off the lamp in his new office, walked into the kitchen, and poured himself a second cup of coffee. He didn't need revenge. He had something better. Influence, respect, and a quietly assembled empire that was now moving without them. Ms. Whitmore, you're going to want to look at this. Lauren glanced up from her laptop, slightly annoyed by the interruption. Her assistant was holding 5 printed faxes, her hands trembling slightly. They all came in this morning. Lauren took the first page. It was a 30-day vendor termination notice. The second page, same. By the time she reached the third, her heart was already pounding. It was Monday morning at Trinity Health Group's headquarters in Atlanta. Lauren was preparing a presentation titled Cost Savings Through Procurement Optimization, the kind of sleek, data-filled deck that usually earned her praise from board members. Outside her office, the day was starting like any other. Calls, emails, coffee. Inside, however, the cracks in Trinity's carefully optimized supply chain were about to explode into a full-blown crisis. Lauren Whitmore, 35, sharp, ambitious, and now visibly rattled. Angela, her HR assistant from last week's termination meeting, trying to stay composed. Coleman, Trinity's regional VP for the Southeast, a man known for his patience, but not his tolerance for operational failures. And in the shadows, Jonathan Miles, absent from the building, but now at the center of everything happening inside it. Trinity had just lost 5 of its largest medical suppliers. Each vendor had sent official termination letters citing the change in account management structure and invoking their standard 30-day opt-out clauses. There were no penalties, no obligations, no appeals. Lauren tried calling them immediately. No one picked up. Not Rick Dawson, not Mark Sullivan, not even their assistants. It was a coordinated blackout. Meanwhile, internal hospital teams were reporting order delays, supply holes, and growing panic. By 11 o'clock a.m., St. Petersburg Regional Hospital canceled 6 non-emergency surgeries due to missing supplies. At 11:30, Coleman stormed into Lauren's office. "What the hell is going on?" Lauren tried to explain. "It's a vendor miscommunication. I'm handling it." "Handling it?" he snapped. "Because I just got off the phone with Tallahassee General. They're threatening to move their entire contract to MedCorp." Lauren's throat tightened. She opened her laptop and began pulling vendor records, trying to find any leverage. Penalty clauses, legal traps, something to reverse the terminations. But every contract had one thing in common. Jonathan Miles was listed as the primary point of contact. Not Trinity, not even a department. Just him. At 1:45 p.m., Lauren's assistant knocked again, this time looking pale. "Jonathan Miles just called. He wants to schedule a meeting." Lauren froze. "A meeting?" "He says he can resolve the supply chain disruptions, but only through his new company." Coleman turned toward her, arms crossed. "You fired the guy who built our entire distribution network. Now you want me to sit across the table from him and ask for help?" Lauren didn't respond. She couldn't. At 2 o'clock p.m., Jonathan walked back into the same conference room where he'd been fired. Only this time he was wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Coleman, 2 legal officers, a representative from Trinity's largest hospital, and Lauren sat waiting. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Coleman began. Jonathan gave a polite nod. "I'm not here to reopen old wounds. I'm here with a solution." He slid a contract across the table. "Miles Healthcare Logistics is willing to fully resume vendor services for Trinity hospitals, effective immediately. But," he added, "all orders must now go through my company, as the sole distributor, with a 25% markup." Lauren opened her mouth to object, but Coleman held up a hand. He reviewed the contract silently. "Given the circumstances, this is more than fair." Lauren looked stunned. 25%? That's... Jonathan turned to her, voice calm. "A week ago, I was considered overhead. Today, I'm the only reason your patients will get supplies on time. This is what value looks like, Lauren." Coleman signed the contract without hesitation. As Jonathan reached across the table to shake hands, he paused in front of Lauren, locking eyes with her for a beat longer. "Thanks for the opportunity," he said with a quiet smile. Then he turned and walked out, no longer an employee. Now, a supplier with all the leverage. 2:00 p.m. Sharp. Jonathan Miles stepped into the same glass-walled conference room where, just 7 days earlier, he'd been dismissed like a relic. But today the room had changed. The tone had changed. He had changed. This time, they needed him. Back in the executive boardroom of Trinity Health Group, the air was thicker than usual, not with confidence, but with uncertainty. The blinds were down. Legal pads were out. Laptops sat open but idle, because this meeting wasn't about data. It was about damage control. Present were Coleman, the Southeastern VP, wearing his stress behind a tight-lipped professionalism, 2 in-house legal counsels, a hospital systems rep from St. Petersburg Regional, and Lauren Whitmore, noticeably quiet, arms crossed, trying to look composed, but failing. Jonathan now stood not as an employee, but as the founder and CEO of Miles Healthcare Logistics, a fully registered medical distribution firm with 5 vendors under exclusive contract. Lauren was no longer the confident disruptor. The sharp edges had dulled. Her eyes flickered with something unfamiliar, humility, or maybe fear. Coleman had one objective: fix the crisis, no matter what it cost. Trinity was hemorrhaging credibility and clients. Surgeries had been postponed. ER units were running low. Partner hospitals were threatening breach of contract actions. Jonathan had what they needed, but he didn't need them. He'd made that abundantly clear when his assistant delivered the meeting request with a firm agenda. Immediate vendor reactivation, 25% markup on all distribution, exclusive sourcing rights via Miles Healthcare Logistics, 0 reinstatement of prior Trinity contract terms Lauren had objected. Coleman hadn't. Jonathan opened his briefcase and handed out physical copies of the contract proposal. Clean, simple, direct. I'm offering full restoration of vendor relationships by tomorrow morning. All 5 suppliers have agreed to resume service under my distribution umbrella. He let the silence hang. However, this won't be a reinstatement of the old system. You'll place all procurement orders through me, and I'll handle logistics, fulfillment, and vendor relations. Lauren leaned forward. 25% markup? That's excessive. Jonathan didn't flinch. It's the cost of stability and respect. Coleman looked up from the contract. These terms are more than fair, he said quietly, considering what we've lost this week. He turned to Jonathan. How soon can you be operational? Systems are already live, Jonathan said. Inventory's waiting. We can resume deliveries by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Lauren couldn't hold back. So what? You fire someone and then pay them more to come back as a vendor? Jonathan finally looked her in the eye. No. You fired someone and now you rent their foundation at a premium because you didn't understand what he built. The legal team had no objections. The hospital rep signed her name first. Coleman followed. The signature page was passed to Jonathan last. He reviewed it silently, then signed. The moment the pen left the paper, a new era began. Not for Trinity, but for Jonathan. He stood up, shook hands with the executives, firm and steady. When he reached Lauren, he paused, extended his hand. She hesitated, then took it. His grip was confident, but not cruel. We all make decisions, Lauren. The smart ones learn from them. By the time the meeting ended, Miles Healthcare Logistics was officially the primary distributor for Trinity's Southeast operations. As Jonathan stepped out into the hallway, his phone buzzed. 5 text messages from vendors confirming their restart protocols. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just exhaled slowly. The man who had once been quietly dismissed had just signed the most consequential deal of his life, without ever raising his voice, without revenge, and without needing a title. Because now he had leverage, and more importantly, he had terms of his own. Monday morning arrived without a single emergency call. No emails flagged urgent. No panicked voicemails from hospital administrators. Just quiet. And to Jonathan Miles, that silence was the sound of something extraordinary. A system working. The supply chain had been fully restored overnight. Hospitals across the Southeast, Birmingham, Tampa, Charleston, received their shipments on time. Not just boxes, but critical items, pediatric IVs, cardiac stents, insulin, surgical masks. At Trinity Health, leadership began breathing again. But back in Cedar Rapids, in a small home office filled with sticky notes, manila folders, and the faint scent of black coffee, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, staring at a photo of his late wife. Catherine, his wife, was never far from his thoughts. She had passed nearly 8 years ago, after a long battle with cancer that exposed every inefficiency in the system he now quietly held together. Jonathan wasn't driven by revenge or power. He was driven by a quiet, stubborn promise. No family should have to suffer because a hospital ran out of what it needed. Also returning in this chapter. Rick Dawson, vendor turned close friend. Angela, former HR rep, now quietly advocating for Jonathan inside Trinity. And a new character, Vanessa, a former logistics coordinator Jonathan once mentored, who he was about to call for a job offer. Not everyone at Trinity was thrilled about their dependency on a former employee turned distributor. Some executives saw Jonathan's return as a humiliation. A few even started whispering about reducing the markup or finding alternatives. But none of them could answer the simplest question: who else can deliver by tomorrow morning? Jonathan knew those whispers were inevitable, but he didn't chase approval anymore. He had earned something more durable: respect. That morning, Jonathan reviewed fulfillment reports from his core vendors. 100% on-time delivery. 0 critical shortages. No vendor complaints. No late invoices. Then he began calling people, not executives, not investors, but doers. He offered jobs to 3 former Trinity employees who'd been let go during streamlining efforts. Vanessa, logistics coordinator. Hector, a warehouse driver with 15 years on the job. Tasha, an admin who knew more about hospital billing than half the finance department. They didn't even ask about salary. They said yes before he finished. On Wednesday morning, Jonathan received an email with a formal acquisition offer. A national distribution company, Helix Core Logistics, offered to buy Miles Healthcare Logistics for $22 million, up front. No strings. He stared at the email for a full minute before closing his laptop. He didn't need $22 million. He needed purpose. He made a note on a yellow pad: do not sell what they tried to destroy. Then he went back to work. By the end of the week, 3 more hospitals in Kentucky and South Carolina reached out, asking to be onboarded under Jonathan's network. Not because of contracts or discounts, but because word had spread. If you want your supplies on time, you go with Miles. He kept his operation simple. No corporate headquarters, no endless meetings, no middle layers of management. Just people who cared. Just systems that worked. That Friday night, Jonathan stood in his kitchen, looking out at the Iowa dusk. The house was quiet. The photo of Catherine was still in its usual place, framed, smiling, beside his desk. He raised a glass of iced tea and whispered, "We did it, Cat. Quietly. Properly. No headlines. Just results." Because in the world of medical logistics, heroes aren't the ones who speak loudest. They're the ones who make sure no doctor ever says, "We don't have that in stock." The subject line read, "Personnel update. Lauren Whitmore resignation. No all-staff meeting. No farewell post. Just an email." And inside the boardrooms of Trinity Health Group, no one was surprised. But many were relieved. It was now 2 months after the crisis. Trinity's supply chain had stabilized, on the surface. But beneath the calm, power struggles simmered. Meetings were more cautious. Board members chose words carefully. And the phrase, Miles Healthcare Logistics, came up more often than anyone had expected. At a quarterly leadership briefing, the tension was clear. Should they keep relying on Jonathan Miles, or find a way to quietly replace him? Lauren Whitmore, once the symbol of modernization, had become a cautionary tale. Her Harvard credentials no longer shielded her from whispers. Vendors refused to take her calls. Hospitals didn't trust her emails. Coleman, the Southeastern VP, had turned from critic to convert. He now defended Jonathan's system openly. "Say what you will. He delivers," he told his peers. And among the background players, Angela quietly forwarded internal reports to Jonathan, helping him stay one step ahead without ever officially rejoining. A growing number of Trinity executives argued for supply chain independence. "We can't be dependent on an outside vendor forever," one said. "We need in-house control," another chimed in. But when pressed with basic questions, who else can replace 5 top-tier vendors within 24 hours? Who has the hospital relationships? Who can guarantee quality, price, and time? Silence. Because no one had answers, except Jonathan. And he didn't work for them. He worked with them. An internal review was launched. It focused on Lauren's decision-making process, risk assessments, and the aftermath of Jonathan's termination. The results weren't flattering. She had ignored red flags, overridden veteran managers, relied on automation without a fallback plan. Worse, she had fired the one person who had built the foundation of their most critical operations. Coleman ordered the findings archived quietly. Trinity didn't need a scandal, but the board took note. Quietly, Lauren's access was reduced. Invitations stopped coming. Then came the resignation. At the annual Trinity Leadership Forum, Coleman stood at the podium. "Let's be clear," he said. "Technology doesn't build trust. People do." He clicked to the next slide. A graph showing supply performance metrics since Jonathan's company took over. It was flawless. "There was a time we called this man redundant. Now we call him essential." No one clapped, but heads nodded. Lauren, watching the live stream from her apartment in Chicago, closed her laptop slowly. Later that day, Trinity signed a 5-year contract with Miles Healthcare Logistics, with an option to extend 3 more years. The new agreement included training for internal staff on vendor relationship management, shared logistics software access, joint quarterly reviews, not for control but collaboration. And Jonathan? He didn't ask for a desk. He asked for autonomy, and they gave it to him. A week later, Jonathan received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. He opened it cautiously. "Jonathan, you were right. I didn't see what you had built until it fell apart. What you did, what you're still doing, it matters more than I ever understood. I hope someday I build something half as real. Lauren." He folded the note, placed it in a drawer beside Catherine's photo, and closed it gently. No revenge, no victory lap. Just a quiet acknowledgement that in the cold war of leadership, the one who outlasts isn't the loudest. It's the one who still shows up when it counts. There were no emergencies, no late-night disruptions, no one calling to ask, "Where's the shipment?" And for Jonathan Miles, that silence was the loudest praise of all. Because when logistics ran smoothly, that meant he'd done his job right. It was a quiet Thursday evening in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn. The house was still, save for the soft hum of the desktop monitor in Jonathan's office. He sat at his desk reviewing the weekly distribution report. All hospital orders, fulfilled, all vendor invoices, processed, all response times, under SLA. A system built on relationships, trust, and unshakable execution was now running with quiet precision. Jonathan, now 53, had become an unlikely cornerstone of healthcare logistics across 5 southeastern states. There was Tony, from Harrison Medical Supply, who once told Jonathan, "We'll follow you wherever you go." Vanessa, his lead logistics coordinator, had grown into a rock-solid operator. And Catherine, always present in her photo frame, smiling from the corner of the desk, reminding him why he started. That night, he received a call from Tony. "Thinking of expanding into Kansas City. You in?" The offer was tempting. Kansas City meant growth, more contracts, more hospitals, bigger infrastructure. But with growth came complexity. More layers, more distance from the people. More risk of becoming what Trinity had become: cold, corporate, distant. Jonathan had built his business differently. Small, tight-knit, human. Could he scale that without losing the soul of what he created? He didn't fear expansion. He feared detachment. He spent the weekend reviewing proposals, analyzing risks, and making calls, but not to consultants. He called Hector, the warehouse supervisor in Birmingham; Tasha, the admin who managed supplier audits; Mark, the vendor who'd been with him since the LLC days. "Can we grow this without becoming like them?" Jonathan asked. They didn't hesitate. "You set the tone, John. If you stay grounded, so will the company." The following Monday, Jonathan signed the partnership agreement to expand into Kansas City under one condition. No new office buildings. No bloated org charts. Every employee, vendor, and hospital partner had to speak to a real human, not a ticketing system. He would grow, yes, but on his own terms. Miles Healthcare Logistics was no longer a backup company. It was now a regional powerhouse, quiet, efficient, and profoundly respected. By mid-November, Miles Healthcare Logistics was servicing 42 hospitals across 6 states. Industry awards began trickling in. Journalists requested interviews. He declined most. He didn't want press. He wanted reliability. Vendors referred others. Former Trinity executives reached out quietly, asking if there was room on his team. Some he hired. Others he didn't. He didn't keep score. He kept standards. That night, Jonathan turned off the office light. He stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker across the fallen leaves. He looked at Catherine's photo on the shelf and said softly, "It's running, Cat, just like I promised. No chaos, no noise, just care." He didn't build an empire with press releases or IPOs. He built it through quiet mornings, steady hands, and 1,000 unseen moments of doing the right thing when no one was watching. Legacy, he realized, wasn't what you leave behind. It's what keeps running after you've gone to bed, and tonight everything was running just fine.